Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you today and to tell you about my Tokyo 2020 or 2021 experience. And I definitely would start by saying Tokyo 2020 was an Olympics like no other. So please feel free to ask me questions throughout. The presentation today, I'm going to talk about it in sort of three components, sort of pre-Olympics, then arrival, and then the actual games. So in terms of the pre-Olympics, that actually was a really, really big part of Tokyo 2020. We actually had our chef de mission meeting in August of 2019. And so that means you go to the host city for a week, meet all the other chefs, you see all the different venues, you go prepared with all the questions from your sports governing body about their different venues. So in this case, we had asked, equestrian, triathlon, swimming, all the different groups, what information they wanted me to retrieve during my visit.
Brenda,
yes.
For the sake of our media partners, could we see you also throughout?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, sure. So, yeah, as I was saying, with regards to the chef's meeting, when we got there, we certainly realized that Tokyo was ready. In 2019, they were ready. For the most part, nearly all of the competition facilities were done, were completed. We could see everything. We saw the village. It was, I would say, 90% complete. We were definitely very, very hopeful that this would be a really, really spectacular games. And then, as we all know, by the close of 2019, beginning of 2020, COVID-19 came along. And it was on March 24th, 2020, that the IOC postponed the Olympic Games due to the raging COVID-19 pandemic. What was that like? Well, it was really nothing short of a logistical nightmare in terms of facilities, transport, booking of tickets, all of the above. I really,
Tony,
is there a question? If anyone has a question, please ask. But as I said, it was a logistical nightmare certainly for the Tokyo 2020 group. But I don't think that anybody but Tokyo would have been able to move through the logistics to make it happen, a year later. So it was decided that the games would not be canceled, but they would be postponed for a year. We all know from our own athletes, from the stories that we heard around the world, from what we experienced. I mean, we were in a total lockdown. Well, our athletes were the same. They were in lockdown, some of them here in Bermuda, others, outside of Bermuda. Flora, as an example, happened to be in South Africa. They were unable to compete. She was unable to leave her home area. But our athletes were absolutely resilient and flexible. And that's really what they had to be. Resilience and flexibility was really the only way forward from 2020 to get to the games to 2021. I mean, Flora did things like, run around the compound, possibly 100 times to make, up the distance. We had some of our own athletes preparing, our athletes commission, was preparing different videos to help people train at home. We saw, many of ours participated in that. And by January 2020, for me, there was just 2021, I mean, there was just an avalanche of emails that came through, and it would be from anything from accommodation to accreditation to freight to medical transport, uniforms, ticketing, everything. It never, ever stopped. I would spend the life of a chef, I know many people think is just glorious, they just see us go. I don't know why we have an echo here. But they just see us go from game to I'm going to just look at my phone and make sure it's not showing up on my phone. Do we still have an echo? Is there some? Okay, let me just get rid of this phone because it's off.
We're still here.
Rafael, could you try muting yourself, maybe?
Yeah, there was an echo. So, okay. So there we go. So then we get to the pre-Olympics. And in the pre-Olympics, it was, we just got inundated, not only by the emails. I mean, I found myself, many people think that for a chef, it's just, go to the games, you get to travel, it's, nothing but glory, but the preparation is something incredible. For me, I was every night, I think from about 9:30 till 1 o'clock in the morning, going through the emails. For the larger countries, it was easy for them because, for many of them, they're doing it as their full-time job. For smaller countries where it's only volunteers, it's really, really difficult because, you have to do it outside of your job hours, and the volume of information was just incredible. So we had, then not only was it the emails, but we had apps coming at us. So we had an OCHA app, which was related to Tokyo immigration and infection control, customs immigration and infection control, along with COCOA, which was a contract tracing app. And those apps, the COCOA was very similar to the Bermuda one, the We Health, but the OCHA app was just amazing. It had all the forms that you would need for customs, all the forms for immigration. And then it was an app that we had to use every single day to indicate whether or not we had dropped our saliva sample, to say how we felt that day, and they monitored, they monitored that. Then we had apps for transport, apps for food. It was just, by the time we were getting to the games, I just wondered, could my phone hold it all? Because that's what it was like. We also had to appoint a COVID liaison officer and a deputy COVID liaison officer. In order for them to hold the games, it was the Tokyo government had all these restrictions. As you all know, COVID did not go away. COVID was just raging at that point. Tokyo was in a state of emergency. And so we had the, we had Julian Fletcher was going as our Athletes Commission. He was a candidate for the Athletes Commission election. So I asked him, he was the only extra person that we had to assist with doing the COVID duties. And so we had Julian as the COVID liaison officer. I was the deputy and the chef. And we had to deal with as I said, the volume of information was just it was overload. Tokyo came up with something that had never been before, that we had length of stay guidelines. So all athletes were only allowed to be in the village, to land in the country, and to be in the village 5 days before their event, and they had to leave within 48 hours after their event. So this was quite different from any former Olympics where people, Jean, if you could maybe stop your mic. So then we had the, with the COVID and the length of stay guidelines, it made it very different because previously athletes could stay generally if we had enough room from the beginning of the Olympics to the end. We know that as a small country, we always come up with difficulties in numbers. There is such a thing as a calculator that they use, and depending on the number of athletes you have is the number of officials. So despite the fact that you often have, you have to do all the same tasks, you just get less people to do them with when you're a smaller NOC. So we also had the submission of activity plans. So the Tokyo government had sent us a bunch of information about lists and lists of all the different places that you could go. They all had numbers with them, and you had to submit an activity plan for each and every member of your delegation that was going to come to Tokyo. And it would have to say, I'm landing in this airport, I'm going to the village. You were restricted. All athletes, all members of the team were restricted to solely arrive in the country, go to the village, or in Flora's case, to the hotel, go to your place of training, go to your place of competition, and then back to your village or your hotel. You were not allowed to travel anywhere else in Tokyo. You were not allowed to take public transit. You only had to take the Games transit. The Tokyo government did everything, and the Tokyo Games people did everything and anything that they could to avoid and to, any problems with regards to COVID. They really did an absolutely stunning and outstanding job. The last issue that we had was the qualification events. Because of COVID, so many qualification events were postponed, canceled, postponed, rescheduled, canceled, postponed. And so the qualification events were happening at the 11th hour. I mean, we didn't know who the team was until June 29th. We did know the rower, Dara Elizadeh, and he could only arrive in the village on the 16th of July, with the opening starting on the 23rd of July, his event starting on the 23rd of July. So if you think not knowing who the team is until the June 29th, it made traveling. I didn't even book my ticket by then because I just didn't know where the track athletes going to make it. We really weren't sure. We had all our hopes set for Janai and for Tyrone, and it didn't quite happen. We also had the misfortune for our equestrian whose horse went lame at the last minute. So we just had all these logistical issues, which made us very uncertain of who the team was, and really until the 1st of July, and I had to travel on the 13th. So just every day was just really dealing with what are the issues of the day, and the staff of the BOA office were, instrumental in helping make that happen. Patty Petty helps us with, travel arrangements, and she actually had to do potential travel arrangements because we still had to submit activity plans, as an example, for the track athletes well ahead of June 29th. In case they were going to make it. So it was a nightmare. But then the arrival, when I arrived on the 14th of July, everybody was very friendly. They were warm and welcoming, and that was fantastic. But when we got to the airport, it was a really interesting thing. So we had to be tested. We were not allowed to leave the airport until we had our negative test. So I arrived at 12 noon, got to the village around 7 p.m. Then we had the arrival meeting with all the folks from Tokyo 2020. We had to confirm the team, get PVCs changed, attend the inventory and inspection of our apartment. And then I had to prepare for the arrival of the rowing team the next day. So now, at least by that time, by the 16th of July, I can say for us, that was the real deal. The games of the 32nd Olympiad were beginning. The village was absolutely wonderful. This here is a picture of the village. This is where we were. So every housing area had sort of 4 buildings. That's where we were, in the port building. This is where they had the store and a few things. This was sort of the village center. And we were close, we were in port. Here was the main dining hall. Up here was the village transport. That's where we'd catch the buses to go. In here was the gym and the rec center and the polyclinic. And then the rest here were the other countries' accommodations. And this is where the village rings were. So just to give you an idea of what the village was very, very big. It was a minimum, I think most people got, was about 20,000 steps a day. So the village, as I said, was wonderful. It was clean. It was very well staffed. It had everything we needed. There was no, for anybody who's been to Japan, you know how clean it is. There was never a scrap of garbage seen anywhere. This was typical. We had 2 of these apartments. It basically, as you came into the apartment, you had a small common room, bare basics, a plastic sort of outdoor table and 4 chairs. You had, there was a shared toilet and shower unit. And then there was a twin room, so 2 twin beds. In one apartment, this bed was taken out and was the table for the chef's room. Then we had a balcony. As I said earlier, our movement was limited to the village, the training site, the competition site, and the morning ritual was get up, do not drink, do not brush your teeth, do your saliva test. So this is typical. This was my room. This is the chef's room, your basic bed, and then just the tables. This was the view from our apartment, beautiful view of Tokyo. You heard that you may have heard in the news that, everybody was on these cardboard beds. Well, it was amazing. Yes, they were cardboard. These were the cardboard beds. And then they had this mattress on top that it came in these different modules, and you could switch it up if you liked a hard bed, a soft bed, or where you liked a bit hard and where you liked a bit soft. It was amazing. You just slip it back, flip it into the cover, and there was your bed. And then the famous Japanese toilets. So this was the really high-tech toilet. Every toilet was like this. The seat was heated. It was all quite interesting. But this here was the actual instructions for the toilet. So if you wanted to stop it, if you wanted washing, all sorts of things. It made for a very interesting time. This is the dining hall. And as you can see, so it was quite different from what other dining halls might have been in the past in some ways, because everywhere had plexiglass. So this was, where an individual would sit. You obviously had wipes so you could wipe down, but they had always somebody there wiping down everything. And it was very difficult to eat because in some respects to have sort of a conversation, often tried to sit across from a team member. So at least you could read their lips, because having these partitions everywhere really made the sound quite difficult. And you can see the Japanese were just phenomenal in terms of, these were all the bins that when you brought up your tray, after, your cutlery had to go in a certain place, your plastic glass, your paper. It was amazing. This is typically what you would see. So here were the servers. There was cuisine from around the world. This was just one of many, many different stations. Impeccable cleanliness and staff that were always there to help you and greet you with a warm welcome and smile. Everywhere you went in the dining hall to have anything to eat, they gave you all the information about, the health information about what you were eating. Around the village, they had these autonomous buses. So they actually, although the bus ran autonomously, but because they just didn't want to risk anything with, with danger, and because they were also preparing for the Paralympic Games, where you might need the driver to help a Paralympian get onto the bus, they did have a driver in it, but the bus ran on its own. It was relatively slow, actually. So most times, or operated slower than most of us would have liked. So most times people just walked. They had a lot of these bicycles around the village, so you could, take a bike and go around. As I said, the village was very, very big. So, one afternoon, the rowing team, we had enough time. We took a bike and, we went around and, just checked out different parts of the village. This was the Parade of Nations. So this is one of the roads within the village that had all of the flags from the 206 participating countries in the Olympics. And this is a picture of Dara and I next to our Bermuda flag. This is the rec center, and in the rec center, you can see that everywhere, this was, where they would play one of the games. Everybody, you had to be masked everywhere. We had masks on. The only safe place that we did not have a mask was within our own apartments. Everywhere else you went, everybody had to wear masks. Everybody complied, making it very safe, but they also had, plexiglass everywhere. So you can see this was a place where you could go and ride and try it out, but there was plexiglass, next to the next person there. And then, so our time was from the first day that, Dara and his coach Rob got there. He spent the next 3 to 4 days before opening day, just doing his preparation and training. He was fortunate enough to have we were very fortunate that he had his boat sponsored. And so when he got there, there was a brand new boat for him. And so he and his coach, Rob, were getting it ready. And then he had to figure out, so it had the list of the team names here. So he had to figure out where his boat was going to be each day. This is where Bermuda was. And then he started donning his most famous and wonderful uniform. In the afternoon, so a typical day for Dara was, in the first few days before his event, was getting up, going to the venue, getting his equipment ready. In the afternoon, we would come back around 1 o'clock. When he came back in the afternoon, have lunch, go to the polyclinic, have his massage if he needed. And then if we had a few minutes just before dinner, then, we'd go around. This was what some of the village groups really decorated well. This is what Canada looked like. They had their moose, and they had this mural on the wall. Whoops, sorry. And then we went to the rings, which was within the village. And you can see Dara and Rob. And then came July 23rd, which was the opening ceremonies. And sorry, these weren't the best pictures. I had lost Earl's pictures for some reason, but we had it was a most amazing feeling to be part of the opening ceremonies. It was quite different from any other opening ceremonies, however, because they had us, for COVID purposes, we must have walked 4 miles before we ever got to the, into the building. Not only we walked that probably 2 miles in our village to get onto our bus to avoid, having too many people together. And then in terms of the way they separated all of the teams, it was another 2 miles just to get into the into the opening ceremonies venue. And then it was, when we got in there, it was really weird to know, we heard music, but of course they just had all those, there were some fans, no fans from Tokyo. It was only the presidents and secretary generals from the various countries that were there. And the rest was, just as you see in many of the other sporting venues, the paper people. So it was so hot. For the games, certainly for Dara's part of the games, it was 91 on the average day. Bermuda, we had the same temperatures as in Bermuda, and same humidity, and it was really, really hot. So Dara had to participate again the next morning, so we left the games quite early. And we're almost done, but this was then the most famous day in Bermuda. And that was, of course, July 27th in Tokyo, July 26th here in Bermuda. And that was our gold medal day. And it was absolutely the most, we weren't sure that the triathlon would go ahead because there was a typhoon. And when we had the typhoon, it was absolutely pouring rain that morning. You can see that we had the rainbows. There were double rainbows just before the event, and I knew Flora. We were hoping that that meant good news for Flora. And Earl, I had given him my BF&M poncho because he was standing there with his camera, and without the poncho, I don't think he would have made it. And then you all know Flora. Flora was just magnificent. From Bermuda, we had Judy, the president of the BOA, Branwen Smith-King, who is the Secretary General, myself, and our COVID liaison officer, Julian Fletcher, in the stands. And I think the three of us were just absolutely numb, biting our nails. We just, especially when Flora was on the bike, we were all like, oh no, it was with all the rain, with the slipperiness. It was just awful. I don't think I've ever been so nervous. And then once we saw that she had finished the bike and she was on the run, it was like, wow. And in the stands, the other NSGBs, because the stands were empty in terms of people from nobody from Tokyo, but there were the other NSGBs were allowed to have other officials like us. And they were all, oh my gosh, Bermuda, 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 this could be your day. They were just, oh, so excited for us. It was the most incredible feeling. And as you all know, there was Flora, a commanding victory, and Flora's gold medal. When Flora arrived, she only arrived a few days before her event, and she really did not want to. She just was so focused. I didn't even want to take pictures. It was just, I had a schedule from Dan. We arrive, get us to the venue, get us to our hotel. Then she did her training. Brenda, get us to, she wants to go for a run here. We need to take the bike into the, down to the competition event. So we just did those things, and Flora was absolutely focused and driven. You could see in her eyes, there was just, get me to that competition day, I'm in. She was just absolutely incredibly focused and driven. And as you know, it worked. After she won, well, I don't think she would have expected the amount of interviews, but her days were filled with interviews like this. This is even getting the Japanese government from our host city, met her at the airport, and she even got interviewed, as I say, right up until the moment she left. The day before she left, she did manage to make it to the village with us. And then she left, went to the airport, had her final, at least in Tokyo, interview. And then for the rest of us, it was going back to the rowing venue and cheering on Dara, because he still had 2 days of competitions left. And he was absolutely incredible. He was inspired so much by Flora, and he finished, went and gave it his best and finished 18th in the world. So after that, it was just, we all literally left right after sort of his event, because we couldn't stay in the village. We could have stayed for the closing ceremonies, but it was another 8 days, and the COVID situation was getting really bad. So we just all decided that was enough, and we had to leave. So it was the most incredible experience, and thank you for letting me share it with you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Brenda, for that wonderful speech and for the insight into what might have taken place at the 2020 Olympics. At this point, I'll give the members a chance to ask any questions they might have. Anyone with questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure. Go ahead, Kaka.
Yeah. Between 2020 and 2021, what would you say was the overall expenditure of Bermuda on preparation for the Olympics?
Actually, because we're such a small NOC, we did not go, we've been burnt before in terms of you know, booking tickets and then having them you know, having to pay for changes, etc. We were really lucky by comparison to the larger NOCs, because we had only had a few people. I think Dan and Flora were the only ones who had we had booked tickets for, and Patty was able to you know, secure a refund. And I think Judy and her husband, you know, it was just them. Everybody else, we didn't book tickets. We really said, you know, we can't book tickets and then go through all sorts of hassle. So we didn't book tickets. Uniforms, again, we waited until we really knew as close as we could who was going to be going, because that's always a big expense for us. So we really didn't have a great deal of expenditure, to be quite honest, for us between 2020 and 2021. We didn't, and we, you know, might have if it came to boats, etc. But then Dara got a sponsorship, so it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brenda, did the athletes know much of the spike in COVID at the time in and around Tokyo? And how were you able to communicate with them? Were you able to communicate with them effectively once it got closer to the event? And did you avoid just passing any such information on to them?
No, I mean, with social media, Rick, everybody, you know, knows they will pick up the information. Of course, some of the headlines, as usual, prior to an Olympics are quite, you know, dramatic and not always the truth. So I think all the athletes, as well as the team, felt quite reassured, I would say, by because all the information and all the things that we had to go through, such as the length of stay guidelines, the activity plans, they also had playbooks that they had athletes and officials playbooks. They told us about all the countermeasures. So I think everybody felt pretty safe, in the sense that, you know, we shared with them always shared with them what all the countermeasures were in terms of just the village itself, the arrivals, departures, everything like that, so that they knew what they were, you know, getting into. And we felt it was absolutely important that they and their teams knew that. Then there were sport specific issues. So, you know, we just really met with team on team and worked through any of the concerns on that. Yeah, I think it was just most disappointing for them that, you know, that spectators weren't allowed, obviously for Flora and Dara, that their families, you know, potentially couldn't be there. But once that hurdle, you know, or that was announced, and I think the athletes still felt very strongly, I've worked too hard to get here, I just have to compete.
Sure.
Yeah.
John?
Okay, do we have any other questions? I just have one question, Brenda, from your experience from the Tokyo Olympics village.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you learned that are practical in Bermuda, to help sports activities deal with the COVID situation. Now, obviously, the Olympics involve very many people right in the middle of the pandemic, and they were able to pull it off. What are some of those things you think are transferable and practical in Bermuda from a sports point of view?
I think what made the 2020 games a success was that 98% of the people followed the guidelines. So there was no people wore masks, and people did the hand sanitization and hand cleanliness all the time, and I think that was the key.
Okay.
And I think and they social distanced where they could. But I think definitely the wearing of masks and the sanitization was the key.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks a lot, Brenda. If there are no other questions, Director Rick, you can go right on ahead.
Sure. Well, first of all, Brenda, we were chasing and trying to get you on for a bit. We want to thank you for a fascinating and detailed presentation, actually. The rigors, listening to you, I know that President Judy Siddle had basically said that someone of your nature, someone with your background from the sports admin, sports participation for more than a few decades would be needed to take our contingent through. And so we're thankful that you were there. We also thank you for bringing this unique perspective on not just Flora's historic feat at the Olympics, but the view from inside the Olympic Village and the sports arenas. We know Rotarians like Brenda, we here at Rotary and in Bermuda will always remember Flora and the small Bermuda contingent led by Brenda that brought back the gold medals. So thanks for the presentation. Thanks for your role in those moments that will live in our hearts and minds for quite a long time. Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.